In the silent crevices of our minds, of our body, and our spirit, tucked behind these stories we tell ourselves, these stories that we identify with, and the narratives that we've inherited in our DNA, lay ancient, ancestral, dormant patterns, curses, even generational karma. But what if I told you that within you also lies the power to disrupt these patterns and to transform them? Today on the Sour Moon Movement podcast, we're going to be talking about the only way to not only bring awareness to these patterns, curses through the science of epigenetics, but to actually disrupt them. Today, we're going to be talking about the 5-step process to forgiveness. Satnam, Satnam, beautiful Sour Moon, Satnam, and welcome back to the Sour Moon Movement podcast, where it is our mission to disrupt ancestral karmic patterns in our lineage by healing the nervous system and rewiring the brain with my AVI method of Kundalini Yoga therapy and A Course in Miracles spiritual psychotherapy. Welcome back, ladies. So we're going to get into today on this very beautiful A Course in Miracles Ancestral Miracle Tuesday on literally the only pathway to actually disrupting these ancestral karmic patterns. And it is the pathway that most people actually, especially women that are struggling with these repeating patterns, avoid. They avoid it because they either don't know how to do this, or they avoid it because it feels like one of the hardest things to actually do. And what I'm referring to is forgiveness. And not only am I here to share with you that it is not difficult to forgive, I am also here to give you the exact process you need to follow, because a big part of why traditional Western modern therapy does not work is because talking about our situation without actually seeing it through the eyes of Christ consciousness, through the eyes of God, through the eyes of higher consciousness is what keeps us in these loops of continued patterns. In fact, the fact that most people go through trauma and do not receive any healing work, which basically keeps them in this energy of inability to forgive, is precisely what keeps these patterns going. It's the fact that we actually do not forgive, that epigenetics, that if you're talking about quantum physics, if you're talking about energy, or if you're talking spiritually, it's what literally guarantees that the next generation is going to suffer through this. Now, I want to explain really quickly before we get into the 5-step process, just what the difference is between ancestral karmic intergenerational patterns of trauma, like addiction, cold depression, childhood trauma, or even toxic relationship patterns, is the difference between that and actual curses. I actually recently did an entire podcast episode just on this, because it is a pretty meaty subject, but I'm going to quickly just summarize to you what it is, because without us understanding this, we will continue also to stay on our victim mentality. So to understand ancestral karma and epigenetics versus curses, we have to understand consciousness and unconsciousness. So most of us are operating throughout the day 90 to 95% unconscious of our thoughts. We literally are on some kind of program of thinking. When it comes to forgiveness and when it comes to grievances, the ancestral karmic patterns that are described in the science of epigenetics are proven even through experimentations that they did on mice. So for example, they put mice in a lab, and what they did is that they brought the smell of cherry blossoms into the environment of the mice. And every time that they shocked the mouse with this electric shock, they infiltrated the mouse's cage with this smell. So the mice started to associate the smell of cherry blossoms with the electrical shocks. Fast forward 2 generations later, these mice then had babies. The babies, even though they were never electrically shocked, when they were exposed to the cherry blossom smell, they immediately became afraid. They immediately started to have the same sensations as the prior ancestors or the prior generation had, because this was coded in the DNA. This is why many times, you are afraid of certain things. Perhaps you're afraid of an elevator perhaps you're afraid of car accidents, it is simply because there was an ancestor that experienced this fear, this pain, and the ancestor did not receive the therapy, the help to be able to heal it, which is why then it becomes energy that becomes imprinted in the DNA, and we carry those genes within us. And when we're not managing our stress, when we're too stressed out, then these genes turn on, and then all of a sudden we're afraid of the cherry blossom smell too, not knowing why. Whereas in curses are a little bit different, because when we go through ancestral karmic patterns, they can be very unconscious, meaning there was child abuse, there was neglect, abandonment, there was toxic relationship patterns, and perhaps you didn't consciously send energy back to that individual. In curses, and these are very prevalent, especially in prior generations, where it was more tucked under the rug, but also done more actively. What occurs is that, let's say that you're a family that has gone through something really tragic, or something has occurred in your family where you receive notice that there is someone that is performing black magic or sending curses to you intentionally. Then the family, instead of doing the process of forgiving, which is what we should be doing in order to protect ourselves and to end the curse, the family then hires someone to then also send a curse back in a form of protection. So many people get stuck in these loops of curses and intergenerational karmic curses because they feel that they are just basically giving back what was given to them. So they're doing it consciously, maybe even holding hatred, maybe even holding grievances and negative thoughts about the individual. And perhaps, like I said, even practicing some form of black magic to protect themselves, which then keeps the curses going. But do you see how in both situations, whether we're talking about ancestral karmic patterns or whether we're talking about actual curses, when there is no forgiveness, the pattern will absolutely continue 1,000%. That is the reason why we repeat these patterns. And so what we need to understand is what we need to do in order to disrupt these, because it doesn't matter if you know that there's a curse put on your family or that you're paying the karma of an ancestor that perhaps was creating curses in your lineage, or it doesn't matter if it's a form of epigenetics that perhaps your grandfather died tragically and he now is needing liberation and forgiveness. It doesn't matter. In either way, we must absolutely follow the process of forgiveness. And there's many reasons for that, as you'll know through the process I'm going to share with you. But we all know that without forgiveness, the brain, the nervous system becomes really, really damaged. I'm talking about biophysical problems. And now evidence, also scientific evidence that shows that through forgiveness, you can heal yourself, heal the body, heal the mind, and heal the spirit. So if that's the case, you would think that most people would actually start to practice forgiveness or find a way to actually forgive. But the truth is that the steps, especially the first one, is incredibly difficult. And the first one is where most people actually get stuck. So let's talk about this 5-step process, which, by the way, I've created a worksheet that you can actually download by clicking in the comment section below, in the description section. You can download this sheet that gives you the exact process to follow to actually relieve yourself from these grievances and these patterns through forgiveness. So the first step is the most difficult one. And this is all through the teachings of A Course in Miracles, which really is the foundational course for forgiveness, for release of guilt, and ultimately for self-realization. And this is an incredibly powerful way to liberate yourself and your lineage and to heal your body, mind, and spirit. But to be able to do this, first, we have to go through the first phase, which is what we're talking about this week. Yesterday, I shared with you in the podcast how to use your astrological birth chart to become aware of which specific patterns you are operating with. You can go check out that episode here previously on my channel. And you can also download that worksheet that I created for you on how to actually find these points in your chart and how to download your free chart. Now that you have that awareness, let's say you pulled that chart and you have that awareness of where or what these patterns are, or perhaps through your own meditation practice, you're becoming aware. What the Course calls the first step of the forgiveness process is what is known as willingness, or what I like to call awareness. And this is why I guarantee you, with to you that the process of forgiveness is actually not difficult. We make it more difficult than it is. And what we need to understand is that because willingness is awareness, the only thing that we are asked to do is to literally acknowledge, to be willing to become aware of the grievances that we are holding within us. And that is done through the practice of meditation or through spiritual psychotherapy exercises that I provide from A Course in Miracles, specifically to disrupt these ancestral karmic patterns in our academy. So what this means is that most of us are in denial, or if you've gone through, especially childhood abuse, like sexual abuse, that's one of the things that gets tucked under the rug. And because it gets tucked under the rug, it is not acknowledged, it is not seen. Sadly, we're going to talk about childhood trauma and inner childhood trauma in an upcoming podcast episode. But sadly, there is no light of awareness that's brought into the pattern. So it's basically disregarded and ignored. And because of that, the person lives with this subconscious pain and projected out as a personality. And that's why the pattern actually continues. I have had clients that I've done this work with, that I've taken them to my academy. And when I first meet them, they're like, oh, there's nothing for me to forgive. What are you talking about? I have forgiven everyone. I don't know what you're saying. And the minute that we start doing the energy work, all of a sudden a flood of awareness comes to them as to what it is that they're really holding on to, whether that is a grievance of hate, of injustice with somebody in the physical plane, or whether there's somebody in the ancestral plane that actually they haven't forgiven, someone that has passed away. It doesn't matter if it's somebody who in the physical plane who you haven't forgiven. I can assure you 1,000% that this stems from a pattern of some ancestor that also had to go through the same thing you're going through. In either case, willingness means awareness, because willingness means you're gonna show up to do the inner work. Willingness means you're gonna show up to integrate the mindfulness practices of meditation to help you recognize what it is that is truly blocking your energy field. What the Course calls the holy instant is basically the moment of awareness. It's a result of your determination to go from believing you are a sinner, which we're going to talk about right now as a process, to understanding yourself as holy. This is the answer, but we can't do that. In fact, even me saying this to someone who hasn't done any inner work feels like blasphemy. It feels like complete lies, and it feels like complete illusions that we can even believe ourselves to be that way. But the Course says that the desire and the willingness to let it come precedes its coming, meaning the desire for you to go from a program of thinking of the world is against me, God is punishing me, I was attacked, I am a victim, just the ability to say, you know what, I want to choose a different program of thinking. Just to say that, just the willingness and awareness to know that you need healing work is enough. Because when you have that willingness, it's what predates the actual healing. You prepare your mind, in essence, in order to recognize what you want to recognize above all else, which is that you're not separate from God and that you're not a victim. So it is not necessary for us to do more. It is necessary that you realize you cannot do more. All you have to do is be willing to do the inner work, to do the spiritual psychotherapy exercises so that the awareness can come. In fact, that is why Kundalini Yoga, which we're going to work on a karmic reset through awareness tomorrow in our podcast episode, is known as the mother of awareness. Because as the yoga of awareness, what the philosophical purpose of Kundalini is to awaken your higher self. See, there's an egoic self, which is your identity to your story of trauma, of what was done to you, or what just happened to you. And that is an identity that we keep a cord attached to. So when you start to practice Kundalini Yoga, you start to awaken the dormant energy at the root spine, at the root chakra. This energy starts to travel through the spine, through breath, through meditation, through mantra. And as it comes to the crown, you start to expand your crown chakra. And as we talk about the biophysical aspects of awareness, your brain chemistry starts to change. Because of this, what you're doing is you're expanding your consciousness, you're healing your nervous system, which ultimately what the nervous system is consciousness. The reason why you can't be in the present moment is because you still think you're your trauma. You still think you're your identity to that story of injustice. And your ego is tied to that identity. And you don't have enough chi or energy in the system to then create glandular secretions that heal the body and that tell you otherwise, that allow you to go beyond the patterns of thinking. You also are not aware. When you are in victim mentality because something was done to you or your lineage, you're absolutely not aware of your power, of God's plan in everything that we're doing. So as the energy starts to become higher and higher, and you start to work with that, your expansion, your awareness grows, your nervous system heals, so you are able to be more present. So that what happens is that over time, we develop this energy to master the thought forms that we've been under for a lot of years, a lot of lifetimes. We're basically able to disconnect from the worldly ego, the identity we've told ourselves we are, and we're able to connect directly with God consciousness, with what is known as the universal Brahma. The cave of Brahma literally sits the crown chakra. And when you do these practices of spiritual psychotherapy, of Course in Miracles, of Kundalini Yoga, when the energy rises, you're able to become more conscious and aware of your truth, which is your truest essence. That is what a Satnam is, beyond the patterns of thinking, beyond the patterns of pain and trauma, because trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma is how you respond to it. This is why two people can go through the same traumatic event, and both people are not going to grow up to be the same adults. And so the first step is you have to be willing to do the inner work, to become aware of where these grievances actually lie. The second step is the actual process of forgiveness. Now, everything in this world is forgivable. Everything, the murder, the sexual abuse, the betrayal, the infidelity, all of it. Just the way there's no difficulty in miracles, there is no difficulty in forgiveness. In order for you to understand that there's no difficulty in miracles, you have to understand that there is no difficulty in forgiveness. So because everything is energy, forgiveness is a vibration that creates the illusion of separation from God, which is why we have to go from forgiveness in the next step to actual acceptance. So when we feel we need to forgive, this is why we need to first become aware of what we haven't forgiven. We're still under the illusion that something has gone wrong, that God is either punishing us, that we've been punished, or that we are separate from our perpetrator, or Judas, the person who actually hurt us. And when we believe this and when we don't forgive, that energy then starts to bleed into the lineage as emotional pain, which then continues to keep us separate from God. Ultimately, what we are here to do as souls in this body is to self-realize, is to allow the Kundalini energy to rise to the crown, to know that God is experiencing herself through us, to do what our brother Jesus Christ did, which is to be on that cross and say, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." The reason that he was able to do that was because he knew he was more than just a physical body. And he was a great yogi that meditated enough to understand himself beyond the body. In a conventional setting, when we talk about forgiveness, people believe that it is giving up resentment towards another. And you're right to punish this person, even though you keep the perception that that person attacked you, that that person sinned against you, and that you are actually justified in resenting and punishing this person. But according to the Course, which is spiritual psychotherapy on steroids, which is the only truth, this forgiveness cannot forgive. Why? Because it actually affirms that the other person sinned and attacked you. And this is going to be very triggering to many people, because you're going to tell me I was attacked. What do you mean there's no sin? Now you're telling me that that's an illusion and that we don't have to hold people accountable? Well, the third process of forgiveness is all about the truth of sin. So I promise I'll get there. But for us to understand this, we have to understand that people act out of their level of consciousness, and that sin is an absolute illusion, because we do go unconscious in this world. People murder other people. People hurt other people. But those are all mistakes and errors that can absolutely be forgiven. The problem with the religious programming that we have is that we believe God is some kind of man that sits on a chair that judges us out throughout the day. when that couldn't be farthest from the truth. God loves us whole and complete. And it's not about not taking accountability or denying that something occurred. In fact, when you take accountability for your unconscious mistakes is when redemption actually happens. So I'm not saying to deny or ignore, but what the shift in perception does is that it helps us understand that what occurred to you was not because of your level of worth. The way that you were abused as a child, the way that there was infidelity, the way that you basically have been in an addictive spiral has nothing to do with your worth. It has to do, especially if you were attacked by someone else, and I'm using that in quotes because there is no such thing as attack, has to do with the fact that that person literally is unconscious, has to do with how they feel about their worth, and it has to do with the fact that they're actually crying out for help. When someone attacks, you can look at all the studies of all of the murderers, of all of the people that have gone and done some really tragic things in this world. And there is a big story of their upbringing, of their childhood, of their neglect. Does this give them now the reason to attack and to hurt others? No. But the way you liberate yourselves is by you understanding that it wasn't done because of who you are. It was done because of who they believe they are. So giving up our false perceptions that another person sinned against us and that we are justified in resenting and punishing them is true forgiveness. Releasing this perception automatically releases our resentment and our desire to punish, which I'll talk about in a few moments, which is all about justice. So what the Course says is that we go from this misinterpretation of what the person did, and that we can realize that we can forgive it all, and we can release these resentments, and that we can release ourselves from the venom that we're actually drinking. So that takes us to the third aspects of the process of forgiveness. So once you become willing, meaning aware, to actually do the work, to become aware of where these grievances are being held, then you go through the process of accepting that there is a journey of forgiveness and realizing what forgiveness truly is. And then you understand the third step, which is understanding the truth of sin. In conventional setting, what we call sin in A Course in Miracles, what we call sin is merely an error. It's a mistake. What this means is that it can be corrected, and it calls for correction, not punishment. What the Bible or what the church or what the religious programming tells us is that we are inherently sinners. So we are born with guilt. And not only are we inherently sinners, but there's no way out of that. When the Course reiterates and tells us over and over again that there is a God that not only forgives, but that does not believe in sin. So this does not mean, again, that people are not held accountable for their mistakes, that people don't have to look at their stuff. It does not mean that relationships don't change form, that there's divorce, conscious with divorce. In fact, I'm going to share with you a story here at the end of how this developed for one of my clients. It doesn't mean that. No one is being asked to stay in a relationship that is toxic, a relationship where the other person is harmful, where the other person is consistently unconscious. We're not talking about that. It does not mean that we don't speak out on injustices or that we even not work to alleviate human suffering. It does not mean any of that. What forgiveness truly means and understanding sin is that we're not asked to look away from what occurred, because acknowledgement is key. This is why most people do not forgive and most people do not heal. They don't even get the therapy work to actually do that. But what the Course tells us is that to not look away, but it is asking us to look through the experience. Looking through the experience is very different. If you know who you are, if you know your intrinsic worth, what looking through an experience means that you can say what Jesus Christ said, which is, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. Forgiveness recognizes that what you thought your brother or sister did to you has not occurred. It does not pardon sins, is what the Course says, and make them real. It sees there was no sin. There was unconscious mistakes from an unconscious being. And in that view, that's where all sins can be forgiven. What is sin except a false idea about God's Son? That's what a sin is. It's a false idea of what your brother, your sister, the person who hurt you, that Judas. That's what that is. Because ultimately, if you really understood why you're here and why you're incarnated, you would actually see that Judas, that person that attacked you, as your savior. That's when we become totally free from the burden of lack of forgiveness, which takes us to the fourth step. And this is why we cannot forgive spiritually, and also why we now understand scientifically why we cannot forgive: acceptance. So what we do in the academy specifically, what I teach women to do, is to go beyond forgiveness to actual acceptance. And there's many reasons why we cannot accept what has occurred to us, because we can't go back into the past and change what occurred to us. The only thing we can do is learn to accept it. Now, the reason why we can't learn to accept it is biophysical. There is science already that shows what happens to the brain, what happens to the nervous system when we don't forgive. It literally deteriorates. Basically, it's like you're running all day on cortisol, because of the stress on your thought streams about what happened to you. And again, many of the times it's unconscious. You're not even conscious that you're doing this. So because you're constantly unconsciously thinking about the experience, and many times you don't even remember, it could be something that happened to you in your childhood that sits in your subconscious, that sits in your body, because the body keeps score. And literally you are operating under this unconscious doubt throughout your day. So that's why you're tired. That's why you don't have enough energy. That's why you can't change your patterns of thought, because your emotions are eating up all of your energy levels. So because the brain physically becomes deteriorated and the nervous system physically could become deteriorated through trauma and through the lack of forgiveness, biophysically, like what I'm telling you, if you've never done preventive medicine work like meditation, which heals the brain and the nervous system, or if you've never done spiritual psychotherapy work like A Course in Miracles, you're going to be very triggered by what I'm telling you right now. You're going to be like, I don't need to forgive. I have read some really sad things. There was recently, I saw something about Drew Barrymore, who literally was quoted as saying that she can't wait for her mom to die, because when she dies, that's when she's going to find her inner peace. Like, you understand that that's when she's going to find her biggest war and turmoil, because deep down, it doesn't matter if our Judas, our attacker, dies. If we don't do the forgiveness work in this lifetime, it's going to eat us up like the venom that it is. Not only that, it's okay. You're going to reincarnate and repeat the same story again, because that's how if you learn to live consciously and you learn to forgive and accept, because you have a stable nervous system and agile brain, you learn to die consciously. And when you die consciously, you don't have to come and repeat the same lessons. In fact, you don't even have to come reincarnate again. That's true mastery. That's what Buddha did. That's what Jesus Christ did. You and I can do that. In fact, later on in the month, as we get closer to Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead, I'm going to do a whole podcast episode on becoming an ancestor, what happens in the death process, and how these cords get attached of ancestral karma, especially in the beginning stages of death. So acceptance is biophysical. We cannot accept what happened, and we cannot forgive what happened because our brains are fractured and our nervous systems are fractured. But spiritually, we cannot accept because we don't understand that our true reality is that we are one with God, that we are the Christ, that we can allow the kingdom to be bestowed upon us, just like Solomon, just like David, because they were great followers of God. They were able to forgive and accept, although one can argue that King Solomon definitely had his dark shadow aspect. But you see how beautiful that is. He had his dark shadow aspect of lust, and yet God still bestowed his kingdom upon him. That just shows you that God is not a punishing God. God says yes, but you have to see yourself as holy, and we cannot see ourselves as holy because we haven't forgiven. So how not forgiving impacts our brain and nervous system is just as important and powerful as how it impacts our spiritual life. When we don't have a daily spiritual practice of meditation, there's a certain part of the brain that doesn't turn on. So science now proves that when you don't have a daily spiritual practice of meditation, of prayer, because this area of the brain is not turning on, you have like a 60% higher chance of becoming addicted to something. You have a 40% chance of suicide, higher than someone else. Yet if you do this inner work to actually shift those perceptions and to go beyond forgiveness to acceptance, Now you've liberated yourself from the illusion of separation from God, from guilt, and you're able to allow the Christ consciousness to be born within you, which is what God calls bestowing the kingdom upon you, which takes me to the last process of forgiveness. And this is known as justice. We see justice as a principle of fairness, which says that everyone should receive only what they deserve. The murderer should be killed, should be put in jail, whatever you believe that, right? So this must be assessed based on an impartial account of how well they have conformed to the law. Again, what did they do? I mean, I think it's horrific to be that person that has to pull the plug and people that sit in the ready for death row. But like, I would also hate to be the person that's like in a jury duty that then gets to decide whether someone lives or dies. Like, that is not my responsibility. And the most judgmental people on others is because they haven't forgiven themselves and they haven't accepted themselves, just to let you know. So conventionally, what justice is a principle that separates us from love, which punishes sinners for their crimes. It's taking vengeance on them. It's a process of deciding who's the guilty one and taking from him or her to give back to the innocent. Justice, as it relates to spiritual psychotherapy on steroids, of Course in Miracles, is very different. And justice is something that I am experiencing right now in my life because I went through the process of forgiveness. Not only did I disrupt the patterns of my ancestors, but I am receiving justice in all areas of my life, because justice for me has been my healing, prosperity, abundance, wealth, the healing of my children, of my husband, of my parents, of my sisters. That's real justice. Justice is not me taking vengeance on someone else. That's why they say your sweetest revenge is your success. Your sweetest revenge, you don't even need revenge, but what God bestows upon you as the kingdom, the reason that David, who conquered Goliath, was given his kingdom was because he was a holy man. He listened to God at all stakes and at all causes, especially as it relates to forgiveness. So what justice truly means is a principle which gives love and forgiveness to everyone with complete impartiality. There's no difficulty in miracles because there's no difficulty in forgiveness. It's a process of this, it's an actual process of true fairness, which gives no punishment and asks for no penalty. If you know who you are, you could be like Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ wasn't on the cross and said, kill them, God, because you love me. Jesus Christ said, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And he knew what was coming. And yet he still didn't want justice. He's not in the ethers now trying to get justice for himself. The justice is the Christ consciousness awakening in you. That's the justice. So this is true fairness. When you truly forgive and you are a miracle worker where you express love, where someone would hold the grievance, that's fairness. Because everyone is the son and daughter of God. Everyone is innocent. They can go unconscious. They make really crazy mistakes, but at the core of who they are God themselves. We're all God in drag, walking each other back home. Yes, the murderer. Yes, the child abuser. But I can say this because my nervous system is way stable because I have a daily spiritual sadhana practice. My brain is super agile. And because I have done the work of forgiveness. Because truly, a lot of people say you have to forgive yourself and then you can forgive others. No. The highest form of yoga is relationships, which we're gonna do a whole episode on that. Because it's one of the most common toxic ancestral karmic patterns. But it's actually through your doing the work of forgiving your Judas, your mom, your dad, your ex, that person who died already but hurt you. That's how you can forgive yourself. What you give to others, you give to you. So if you are holding someone in a grievance, you're not forgiving yourself either. That's how serious this is. So the world's justice is really injustice, us trying to get vengeance, us trying to keep score. That's actually injustice because it's simply a justification for attack. Why? Why don't we want to forgive? Because it gives you life to your identity of And you almost celebrate. When somebody goes unconscious, you're like, I knew he was a bad person. Cancel culture. I knew it. I knew it. Why? So that you don't have to look at your own stuff. If you are judging someone for their unconsciousness, I can assure you 1,000% that in some way or form, you have perpetrated that same unconscious behavior in your life. And you're just not willing to be courageous enough to bring awareness to it. In fact, anytime you're judging others, that's a great opportunity to go right into that and to understand why and what's that trigger inside of you that's causing that. So love, it also makes us believe, when we understand this, that God's love is separate from justice. That basically that we don't have to believe that God is going to punish us too. Because that's the whole thing about justice. Because we think we need to take revenge upon someone, we're actually really afraid that God is going to take revenge upon us for all the things we've done unconsciously. So what we do is instead we hold on to the grievance, we don't forgive, we project it out, and then we make other people the bad guys, the bad, great people, so that God doesn't come over here and put the punishment on me. So when we actually realize the process of forgiveness is actually easy, which is simply be willing to become aware of these blockages, the rest of the process, which becomes a 5-step journey of first, willingness and awareness, second, addressing the forgiveness and what it truly is, third, understanding the truth of sin, 4, acceptance, and 5, understanding justice. That is when we can actually disrupt the ancestral karmic patterns. And that is exactly what happened to me. When I followed this exact process, which I actually created inside of my academy, I stopped seeking justice. So I stopped trying to get revenge. I stopped using my energy for destruction instead of creation. And what God did was bestowed upon me my kingdom. And the justice that I received was what I just shared with you all. Healing for myself, healing the relationship with my husband, healing the relationship with my mother, healing the relationship with my father, healing the relationship with my children, abundance, prosperity, wealth, all of it came after I released myself from these grievances. Why? Because now I could use this energy for creation. Now I could use this energy of those emotions that I was using to hold on to those grievances to actually stay connected to God, to intuitively know what it is that I need to do and move towards. And in another way, I can share with you a really perfect example of something that happened in my academy with a client of mine. When she first started the journey with me, she was actually going through a separation. It wasn't a divorce yet. Now they're finalizing the divorce. But she was going through a separation where there was actually another woman involved. And the other woman was incredibly unconscious throughout the process when she was in my academy. And meaning that the other woman was very angry, very feisty, very abusive, very unconscious. And you obviously, I understand why. I mean, imagine the level of guilt from that woman to break up a family and how that guilt is projected out. So my client, she did the inner work. It's like God really brought her here to prepare for all of this. And as she was going through the work and we were talking about all of this, she came to a point where she literally told me, I know exactly what you're saying now, because at the beginning, and this is not a long journey, over 1 year, she was able to get to this point. How many people, especially when there's infidelity or a betrayal, stay jaded, angry at men, at the world, at God for the rest of their lives? I mean, my grandma, that's a perfect example. My grandfather was murdered, and he was murdered because of another woman. So my grandma, when he died, she found that out. She found out that the death was because of another woman. And throughout her entire life, my grandma could not forgive. She could not forgive men. She could not forgive my grandfather. And it was very, very difficult for her to die because she was still holding on to these grievances. When you don't forgive, you're really afraid, because you're afraid of a God that's going to be on the other side punishing you. And there was a pattern of that, of like basically not trusting men. So she lived her entire life that way. With this client of mine, it was so beautiful because she said, I've gotten to a point in my life where I truly have compassion for this other woman. I truly am not triggered. I truly am not looking to be reactive to waste my energy. I truly wish healing upon this woman so that my children, because she has children with the other person, are not impacted. That is a level of sovereignty where she's not drinking the venom anymore, where she actually has released herself from the shackles of this experience. Because, like I said, it relationships sometimes need to take form. Some of the lessons that we need to learn as women is not to heal the relationship, although I do believe all relationships are healable. But sometimes you get a situation where the other person, their karma is so heavy that they're not willing to actually move into your vibration. So that's why it is perfectly normal and okay for relationships to take different forms in this world, for there to be conscious divorce, separation, and things of that nature. In her case, even though it was unconscious and it started that way, now she can really build and work towards what's important, which is those children. Because if you have a situation where, especially you have two women fighting against each other through a separation, you know that's going to leak into all areas of the children's lives. And even worse, the daughters are now going to have to repeat that pattern. It was very, very obvious. It's been very, very obvious to see that, especially as it relates to toxic relationship part of patterns, how the lack of forgiveness is actually what keeps you in the same patterns and loops, which we're going to go do a whole new episode on just relationship patterns. So through this work of stabilizing our nervous system, rewiring her brain, getting chi to move through the system, having a connection with God, doing the work of forgiveness, because there's specific exercises, spiritual psychotherapy work that we do inside the academy, she was able to get to this point of release. She's able to now align with her life purpose. She's able to now live out her life. She's able to see the blessings and the miracles in the divorce and the separation. She's at peace versus what so many women do, which is stay angry and believe all men are trash and not trust anybody in this world. I think I'd rather do a years of inner work than stay in the lateral option. In fact, I know that because that was one of the biggest karmic lessons I had to break myself. So everything is healable. Everything is forgivable. And if a person has died or is no longer in your life, you still have to do the forgiveness work. Because if you don't, you're going to set yourself up to repeat it in this lifetime, in the next lifetime, and your daughters are going to repeat it. Their daughters are going to repeat it until somebody has the courage to finally say, you know what, it stops with me. I'm going to change this pattern and it's going to be done. So as you can see, this is not a hard process. It is a process that you simply have to be willing to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to created a sheet that goes through this exact process that you can click on the comments below to download. So you can have this with you and you can begin your own journey. And of course, join me tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to be actually practicing a karmic reset that'll help us through the awareness and willingness into forgiveness to rewire the nervous system and brain to help us really move beyond these patterns of grief, these patterns of addiction, these patterns of full depression, of child abuse, of toxic relationship patterns that we inherit in the. I want to thank you all so much for your beautiful energy. Yaya says, amen. Yaya is a pro at this. We've been working on this, and you know how much this has liberated us and our lineage. So I thank you so much, sis, for joining us today. And like I said, join me again tomorrow at 10 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. We'll be going through this karmic reset. I'm going to explain to you a little bit more about Kundalini Yoga technology, how that brings us awareness of our karmic patterns, and more importantly, how to actually disrupt. So thank you for you. Remember to subscribe, set your notifications so you're notified when I am going live. And thank you for also sharing these videos with your community. I'll see you tomorrow.